Chapter 29. Memories of Ancestors. You look around you and you see something from long ago. I look at the bones and the history and think of yesterday and tomorrow. What my people knew then, we must know now. Without that knowledge, we cannot survive. The memories of ancestors, how they lived, what they hunted with, even their rituals and legends, hold great meaning to us here and now. Never forget that. It may mean the difference between life and death. From the Journal of Dr. Madeline Fallingwater. By mid-October, the nights were quite chilly, but Jess had managed to bag a large buck with one clean shot with Madge's deer rifle, a '94 Winchester model. It was easy once she had thought about their habits. They were active at twilight and at first light. Conveniently, Jacob was now sleeping a good portion of the night. He woke around 2 a.m. for a feeding and then slept until 8 a.m., sometimes even 9 a.m. Jess had fully recovered from his birth now, and the extra time he was sleeping meant she wasn't as sleep-deprived as she had been. Thanks to better living conditions and nutritious food, she felt energized, especially in this quiet, peaceful place. Each morning, she would get up carefully, nestle Jacob against Madge, and slip out of the cave and down to a stand of trees downwind from the water's edge. She had studied the deer tracks, and it appeared that several of them always came to the same place to drink from the lake. The first day, she headed out too late and met a surprised buck heading back. The second day, she moved at the wrong time, startling the small group of deer before they were in full range of her scope. The third was a success. One shot into the shoulder as the young buck stood broadside 20 yards away, killed the great animal instantly. She stood over its body, thankful at the magnificent creature's quick death. No suffering, and the animal was dead before it hit the ground. The hunting she and Aaron had done at the cabin had not included deer, not because they weren't around, and Aaron had certainly wanted to try, but the .22 rimfire was far too small of a caliber to be an effective and humane kill. Jess smiled sadly at the thought of her friend. Aaron would have been so proud of her right now. They had all quickly become familiar with the area and moved about the surrounding woods with assurance once Madge showed them other signs that would indicate the location of the cave if any of them got turned around or confused. There were notches on trees, rock piles, and rags tied to branches to help point them back to the rock shelter. The cave was extensive. The back of the sleeping chamber led to 3 additional chambers. A section used to store dried foods was on the left, and then the passage emptied onto a second small chamber, which contained another dig site. Madge explained that it was a sacred burial site, and asked them not to go any further than the food storage chamber. Beyond the burial chamber, there was another chamber that had collapsed. The burial site and beyond are not only sacred, but also in danger of collapse, Madge explained. We had to abandon efforts in that area until we could get it shored up better. She looked sad. And of course, I couldn't do it on my own. The thought of the cave collapsing was frightening until Madge explained the architecture of the cave and showed them the supports that had already been put into place. As long as we don't get a major earthquake, like the New Madrid earthquake in 1811 to 1812, we'll be just fine here. She smiled crookedly. If an earthquake that size hits, well, let's just say it's the last thing any of us will have to worry about. Even outside wouldn't be safe. The 1811 to 1812 series toppled millions of acres of forest. The rest of the cave traveled for miles. There was another large passage leading west from the back of the large inner chamber. David followed the stream with a lantern in hand for several hundred yards until it disappeared into a rock wall. The cave continued for miles, Madge informed them, but warned them of the dangers of becoming lost in the different passages and sub-chambers that branched off in different directions. One night, not long after they had decided to stay for the winter, David had dreamed of Aaron. It had been more of a memory, really. He had never spoken of what had happened in the farmhouse, and Jess had never asked. He awoke with a shout, and it had startled Jacob enough that the baby began to wail. It was early. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon, and he slipped out past the campfires and through the small entrance to the outer chamber. He knelt near one of the pits and stared into it. The sections were neatly marked, and he could see that one of the pits held a small skeleton. Next to it was a spear and what appeared to be the remains of woven grass moccasins. He stared at the hole and tried to forget the dream. A few minutes later, Madge's bony hand on his shoulder caused him to flinch. Jacob had stopped crying. Perhaps he had been lulled back to sleep. "Meansay, you are troubled by your dreams. A burden shared can be a burden halved. Will you share with me what yours is?" David fought the tears welling up inside him. It was a dream. He wiped at his eyes with the back of his shirt. It smelled and was stiff with dirt. He needed to wash it soon. "It was more than a dream, Meansay. It was about what happened at the farmhouse and how Aaron died, wasn't it?" The old woman was persistent. She had watched David for weeks and knew that whatever had happened in that farmhouse was eating at him. He pushed himself so hard, helping out wherever needed and sinking into his cot each night, exhausted from work that would have tired a full-grown man. It was as if he were trying to atone for something. Yes. He couldn't even put the words to it. "It was my fault. Aaron died, and it was my fault." Madge sighed and tugged at him until he turned and faced her. She met his eyes with her soft, brown, liquid ones. "Do you trust me?" Yeah. I guess so." Her face was solemn. "Tell me what happened, and I will tell you the truth of it. If you were responsible, then you must unburden yourself, Meansay. Do you trust me to be objective, to tell you honestly what I think?" He had held it in his heart for far too long, and it came spilling out then. The memory of that afternoon tearing from him in great gasps of pain and guilt. "I wanted to explore the farmhouse. I had done it dozens of times in town, there in Clinton. I'd seen bodies, even found some houses where people were living, and they'd just told me to go away or given me a can of food and told me to not come back. We were in the middle of nowhere, so I figured, why not, right?" The boy's tears poured forth as fast as his words. "Aaron wasn't far behind me, but she headed for the farmhouse, and I headed for the barn. I had wanted to find a small shovel. I saw one, but it was mounted high, and I was trying to find something to climb on. Before I could do that, I heard Aaron scream." David gulped, his cheek wet with tears, and wiped his nose on his shirt. Madge reached out and patted his shoulder. "Go on." "I went in through the back as quiet as I could, and I was scared, real scared. I wanted to run, but I knew she didn't have a gun, nothing to fight back with, and I knew those soldiers, the ones Jess and Aaron got away from, they did bad things, He looked down at the ground, unable to speak it out loud. "They did terrible things, yes." Madge's answer was soft and forthright. "You were brave to go in, Meansay." "I killed one of them." He looked scared then, his eyes darting to her face and searching for any recrimination, but there was none. I'm not sorry I killed him, but it didn't matter 'cause Aaron still died. She saw him aiming at me and ran towards him." His voice rose in pitch. "She died trying to save me. What if all they were going to do was take her back with them? If I had run back to Jess, warned her, we could have stopped them together." "Oh, Minse, David, you are—" The old woman's eyes filled with tears. "You are not to blame, my brave one. You did what was right and what was brave. You did what a warrior would do." She placed her thin, bony hands on each side of his head, stroking his tangled, unkempt hair. How long had this child been without parents to love and protect him? And how had he risen to the occasion, willing to take so much on and expect so much from himself? "You are not to blame," she repeated firmly. "They would have taken her to a place far worse. They would have done unspeakable things to her, and they would have killed her in the end. Never blame yourself again for this." Behind her, Jess had appeared at the rock entrance. She had heard it all, the details she had dreaded asking about and yet wished she had known. To hear how it had all played out was as much of a relief as it was painful. She knew she had blamed him in some small corner of her heart, and been afraid to ask for fear she would truly hate him if she knew the truth of it. Instead, she found she was relieved. He had tried to protect Aaron, just as she had given her life to protect him in return. Madge had said they were a family, and she was right. They were. She placed her hand on David's shoulder, startling him. Madge looked up at her, her old face lined with wrinkles, a question in her eyes. "Madge is right, David," she said, tears in her own eyes, her voice unsteady. "Family protects family. That's what you did for Aaron, and that is what she chose to do for you. We are a family, and I wouldn't want to have it any other way." It was a healing moment for all of them. The days and weeks that followed slowly became happy ones as the odd, mismatched band grew to know each other better and make new, gentler memories. One of the other anthropologists had been an avid bow hunter, and Madge had his bow and arrows. They were composed of an ultramodern, lightweight substance, and she encouraged Jess and David to practice with targets daily. After watching him practice, she clucked in approval to Jess. "Minse is grown beyond his years. He knows when to be quiet and listen and watch. His aim improves every day." By the end of their second week at the cave, the boy insisted on carrying the bow and arrows with him everywhere. As Jess and Madge fished on the edge of the lake early one morning, he moved quietly along the southern edge and disappeared into the forest. Quincy followed silently behind. Tina watched him go. "He been practicing walking so he don't make any sound at all." Madge just smiled and patted Tina's head, running her bony hands through the little girl's short brown curls. The months the two children had spent alone had left the small child with a mane of filthy, matted, dreadlocked hair. They had finally given up on getting the worst of the mats out and cut it short the week before. Tina had cried during the entire ordeal, but at least now they could keep it under control. Madge kept the little girl busy pulling grass and collecting plants while Jess fished. She had fashioned her own fur-lined sling for Jacob and cooed and sang to him. This gave Jess a relief from the constant care. She was surprised, since up to this point Jacob would tolerate no one holding him but Jess. He still screamed if David or Tina tried to pick him up, but with Madge he was content unless he needed to nurse. Madge pointed at different plants and explained their uses to Tina, who despite her young age listened and watched intently. Jess pulled out 3 good-sized, small-mouthed bass and dumped them into a bucket of water. They kept a lid on it to prevent the fish from jumping back out. Jacob squawked in hunger, and Madge had just handed him to Jess when they heard a loud whoop, and Quincy let out one sharp double bark. "I got one! I got one! Oh, wow, I got one!" They could hear David's voice in the distance. He couldn't have been more than 100 yards away. Jacob squalled in frustration as Jess paused and looked into the woods. A deer? With only one bow and arrow? No way. She looked at Madge, who smiled smugly, and waved her fingers at Jess to go ahead and feed the baby. 3 is enough fish for now, she said, reeling in the line. Besides, it's around 10. They'll be moving towards deeper waters now. You sit and feed Medanga, and I'll go help Mince, who is living up to his name so well. She beckoned to Tina. Nidawi, come. We will help your brother dress his first kill. She took the little girl's hand, and they quickly disappeared into the trees. It was past noon when all 3 of them reappeared, Quincy leading the way. The little dog's tail wagged furiously, and from the blood on her muzzle, she had already had a fresh treat. David was strutting, his small chest jutted forward. His shoulders were high and his back straight, his eyes shining with pride. Madge was grinning too, proud as a mother hen. They had rigged a bower of sorts, and they dragged the deer carcass behind them. It was partially dressed, and Jess blinked at the surreal scene. Before her were one old woman, 2 little kids, 1 dead deer, and one hell of a lot of blood caking them and the mutt running circles around their feet. The corners of her mouth curled up. Damned if he hadn't gotten that deer after all, and with only 1 bow and arrow. Lunch was an abbreviated observance. They ate quickly and got to work skinning and butchering the enormous buck. Jess's stomach roiled a bit, and David actually looked as if he were about to be sick. He gulped hard and got back to work. That seemed to impress Madge even more than the kill. They set up the meat in a smoke hut just 10 yards south of the cave. Madge's team member had built it 2 years ago and supplemented their packaged food with fresh out-of-season deer during the past 2 dig seasons. Little of the deer went to waste, and Madge even knew how to preserve the hide, which Jess paid special attention to. Later that winter, it would come in handy during the cold nights. They were finally finished by late afternoon, and David and Madge prepared the bass, stuffed with wood sorrel, wild carrot, and other fresh edibles that Madge and Tina had gathered. They feasted on the succulent fish, and as they finished, Madge turned to David and made a small bow in his direction, with great formality. Mince, you have lived up to your name truly this day. The spirit of this great deer was sacrificed so that we might all live. Will you tell us now of how you accomplished this great deed? Story time, as Madge called it, had become a daily theme for the little group. Usually Madge would tell them a story about her ancestors. Other times, she encouraged Jess or David to tell a story that they knew. Jess soon found herself remembering the tales from the Grimm's brothers and Hans Christian Andersen. David would often share a portion of Harry Potter, especially the first 3 books. His mother had grown up with the series, attending the movies into her teens, and been excited to share them with him. The nightly story time had begun to include props and theatrics, and everyone looked forward to what performance the evening would bring. He grinned. Okay, sure. He looked around, thought for a minute, and then stood before beginning. I walked into the dark forest, quietly without making a sound. I had seen the deer before, and I had followed his tracks a few days ago. I knew if I walked quietly, he wouldn't know I was there, and I'd have the best chance at a good, clean shot. He looked around at the small group, and Jess nodded to him encouragingly. So I walked about 100 yards in, and found a good place to keep a lookout, somewhere I knew the deer would come by if he wanted to go drink from the lake. I sat for a long time. I was about to give up when Quincy whined quietly. I looked down at her and she was pointing with her foot, and when I looked at where she was pointing, it was the deer. I had the bow and arrow ready in my hands, and I raised it up, took aim, made sure, and then let the arrow fly. He yelled then, and thwack! It hit him in his chest. Jacob woke with a fitful cry from the yell, nuzzled at Jess's breast, and fell back asleep. David looked sheepish until Jess grinned at him. "You did great, David, really. And you were amazing. I never thought an arrow could kill a big deer like that." The boy lit up, glowing with pride. He went on to describe how Madge helped him send a prayer of thanks to the deer's spirit for giving its life for them. Night had fallen by now, and the fire was a lone light in thick darkness. As they settled down for the night, dampening the fire and snuggling under blankets, Jess heard David yawn and comment, "I really think we need at least one more deer to get us through winter, though." The fire crackled quietly. Tina burrowed under the blanket in a small ball against her big brother. They were safe, well-fed, and happy. Far, far away, guns cracked off shots, and bullets tore through flesh and bone. But this little band heard none of this, only the crackle of the fire and the occasional hoot of a nearby owl.